Good day and welcome to the Santhera's Expanded Access Program webinar. As a reminder, today's call is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Deborah Miller of Cure Duchenne. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and welcome to Cure Duchenne's webinar series. I'm Deborah Miller, the CEO and founder of Cure Duchenne. We're very pleased this afternoon to host a presentation explaining Santhera Pharmaceuticals' BreatheDMD U.S. Expanded Access Program. I'd like to thank the team at Santhera for their innovative thinking and their dedication to the Duchenne community. We're very pleased to have Dr. Catherine Wagner with us today from Kennedy Krieger Institute, who will present the details of Santhera's Expanded Access Program. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature on your screen. And to begin, Dr. Mike Kelly, Cure Duchenne's Chief Scientific Advisor, will be moderating this webinar and fielding questions at the end. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to do the introductions. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Deborah, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this Cure Duchenne webinar, where we're going to learn more about the Expanded Access Program for idebenone in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, obviously being conducted by Santhera Pharmaceuticals. Today's presenter is Catherine Wagner. Catherine is the Director for the Center of Genetic Muscle Disorders at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, and also the Professor of Neurology and Neuroscience at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. She's also the Chair of the Treat NMD Advisory Committee on Therapeutics. Dr. Wagner obtained her undergraduate degree from Yale and her medical and doctoral degrees from Johns Hopkins. She joined the faculty of Johns Hopkins in 2000 and Kennedy Krieger Institute in 2009. We're also joined today by Dr. Jody Wolf, who's the head of patient advocacy at Santhera, and Dr. John Karafalidis, who's the head of medical and scientific affairs at Santhera. And as Deborah said, we'll be taking questions, and both of these Santhera colleagues will be available to help address some patients' questions regarding idebenone, as well as the logistics of the Expanded Access Program. So without further delay, it's my pleasure to hand the presentation over to Catherine to take it from here.
Thank you and good afternoon. So it's a pleasure to talk to you about the Expanded Access Program, or EAP, for idebenone in Duchenne. As way of disclosures, I've served as a consultant for Santhera, and I hope to participate in the Expanded Access Program with idebenone. By age 9 to 14, most patients suffer a complete loss of ambulation and experience the onset of respiratory decline. This figure shows some of the milestones, disease progression, and symptoms of Duchenne. And you can see that by ages 8 to 24, there's a loss of ability to breathe independently and also the start of respiratory assistance. There's a 50% loss of baseline respiratory function in this age group. A little background on idebenone. It's an investigational drug for the treatment of patients with DMD and respiratory function decline. It's an oral drug. Its tablets are 150 milligrams, and it's dosed at 900 milligrams per day, given as 300 milligrams 3 times daily. It targets mitochondrial dysfunction. This diagram shows the proposed mechanism of action of idebenone. With a loss of dystrophin, there's an influx of calcium into the cell. This leads to mitochondrial dysfunction, and there's an increase in ROS, which can be blocked by idebenone, and idebenone also can increase energy output of the mitochondria. This leads to less cell death and less muscle degeneration. This diagram shows the clinical trials that have been done in idebenone in Duchenne. The Delphi and Delphi-E trials, the Delos phase 3 trial in non-glucocorticoid steroid users, and the Sideros trial, which is ongoing in glucocorticoid steroid users. The Delos trial looked at the safety and efficacy of idebenone to delay respiratory function decline in patients not using glucocorticosteroids. Patients were randomized 1-to-1 to receive idebenone or placebo. The key eligibility criteria were that they were 10 to 18 years old, off glucocorticosteroids, and in respiratory functional decline. The primary endpoint was to look at a change in peak expiratory flow from baseline to week 52. And these are the results from that trial. As you can see, there was a decline In the placebo-treated group, in the respiratory function, the peak expiratory flow shown in gray, and there was less of a decline in those treated with idebenone, shown in orange. There was a 6.27 difference between these two groups at week 52, with a p-value of 0.31, indicating that these were statistically significant. Idebenone had a good safety and tolerability profile. The majority of adverse events were deemed to be mild or moderate in severity by trial investigators. And here you can see some of the main adverse events, which were very similar between the idebenone population and the placebo population. The CITEROS trial, which is currently ongoing, is to assess the efficacy of idebenone compared to placebo in slowing the loss of respiratory function in patients with DMD receiving glucocorticosteroids. They're randomized 1-to-1 to receive idebenone at 900 milligrams a day or placebo. Now, what is the Expanded Access Program, or EAP? EAPs are permitted by the U.S. FDA. These programs allow eligible participants to gain access to a medicine under investigation before it is approved by regulatory authorities. Patients must have a serious or life-threatening disease or condition, and that there is a lack of satisfactory therapeutic alternatives. The EAP for idebenone is to provide access to idebenone prior to regulatory approval and commercial availability for patients with DMD. Through the BreatheDMD program, eligible patients in the U.S. with Duchenne can obtain access to investigational idebenone at no cost. This program did begin in February 2018 and will continue until December 2018 or extended until approval is obtained. 250 patients will be enrolled, and there'll be up to 35 sites. Here are some of the key inclusion and exclusion criteria. Patients must be 10 years or older. They must have a peak expiratory flow or a forced vital capacity less than 80% or greater than 25% per the medical records or at enrollment visits. They need to be able to swallow medications. The Pneumovax 23 or annual flu vaccine is recommended but not required. They're excluded if they're eligible for the CITEROS clinical trial, and I'll go over those eligibility criteria in a minute. If the physician determines the patient is at high risk of fatality from lung infection or cardiomyopathy, if there's a medical condition or lab abnormality that the physician feels would interfere with treatment, or if there's moderate or severe hepatic or severe renal impairment. These are the CITEROS clinical trial inclusion and exclusion criteria. Again, males 10 years or older, ambulatory and non-ambulatory, documented with the diagnosis of Duchenne, use of steroids for at least 12 months with no dose adjustments in the last 6 months, a forced vital capacity between 35 and 80%, pneumonia and influenza vaccines, able to reliably complete pulmonary function testing. They're excluded if they're participating in another trial or intake an investigational drug within 90 days before the trial, if there are ongoing exon skipping or read-through therapies, if they have symptomatic heart failure, if they have asthma, pneumonia, or the presence of other respiratory illness, if they use the chronic use of bronchodilating or bronchoconstricting medications, or any bronchopulmonary illness that requires treatment with antibiotics within 3 months prior to study, and planned or expected spinal surgery during the study. The EAP program is going to capture safety, routine efficacy, and quality of life data. This will take the form of spirometry information, such as pulmonary function testing during normal visits to the neuromuscular center every 6 months. There will also be optional quality of life assessments at baseline and every 3 months. These are the Egan classification and the Epworth sleepiness scale. The information on the program is available at www.breathedmd.com or at clinicaltrials.gov if you search under idebenone. This table shows the overview of the assessments that are going to be done every 6 months, for first showing you at baseline, then every 6 months at the end of trial. As you can see, most of these exams and testing are ones that are done during a normal neuromuscular visit. This will include respiratory function, blood oxygen saturation measurements, and a discussion of adverse events and concomitant medications. As I mentioned, there'll be some optional quality of life measures. Patients are asked to voluntarily complete every 3 months short health-related quality of life instruments, the Egan classification scale done in an enrollment visit, and the Epworth sleepiness scale done in an enrollment visit. And here again is the website for more information on this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to allow a few minutes for people to formulate that and ask some questions. I've got a couple here that I can reach out right now, and let's see if we can start a discussion. So one of the first things that I would ask is, given the established safety profile that we've seen in the idebenone, is there any possibility of the drug in an expanded access program being given to children that are younger than 10 years of age? And I'd ask that of the Santhera reps that are on the call.
That's a great question, Mike. This is John Karafalidis, Head of Medical Affairs at Santhera US. This program was designed to align with our clinical development program. And in general, with all of our development program as it relates to DMD, we focus on patients 10 and older. And right now, we have to establish some limits for the program, and we are focusing on patients that are 10 and over, mostly to align with our clinical development program within DMD.
Got it. Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Other thoughts that parents have is people are very familiar that the mechanism of this compound is somewhat being taught by coenzyme Q10. And is there a contraindication here for parents who may look for coenzyme Q10 and try and take it on top of idebenone?
I don't think there's a contraindication, but I'm not sure that there's an additional efficacy of taking both drugs.
Yes, Dr. Wagner is exactly right. And just to add, we know that coenzyme Q10, the structure of coenzyme Q10 is quite different than that of idebenone. Coenzyme Q10 has a very long, what's called a fatty acid attached to it, and that doesn't allow it to move freely in and out of the mitochondria. And because of this chemical structure of coenzyme Q10, there are some structural differences that then result into some biochemical differences in the body when patients take the two. We know that biologic activity of idebenone requires, interaction with the cellular enzyme, a specific enzyme, and we know that CoQ10 cannot basically interact with the same enzyme, this critical enzyme. It doesn't allow for the engagement, the structure of coenzyme Q10.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's always insightful to parents. Another question that comes up is there any cost associated with this to parents?
There's no cost to participating in the EAP program. The drug is being provided by Santhera, and the assessments are part of the normal neuromuscular evaluation.
Very good. Thank you, Catherine. And one other question that perhaps would come up in parents' minds is there any opportunity here for some of these older boys, that certainly older than 10, where some of these key assessments could be conducted at home, for example, rather than moving to clinical centers?
I'll have to defer to
in general, with an EAP, the program is supposed to align with standard of care. And your question's a good one. As the patients age, unfortunately, going to their centers may not be as convenient. But the way that the program is structured now, it is, every 6 months that they would go to their normal appointment, if you will, and that is consistent with guidelines that even when they're non-ambulatory and older, hopefully they're still going at least every 6 months. And it's at that 6-month visit is when they'll get their drug as well. It's basic spirometry that typically is done that's already being captured that will also capture as part of this EAP as well as safety.
Excellent, thank you. And are these the same sites that are being used for the Sideros trial?
They're not all the same sites, so there are some that are doing both Sideros and the expanded access program, and some that are separate.
Okay, thank you for that. Just reminding parents that if they have any further questions, just type them up online, and we can get the company's reps to deal with those today. One other one is, can you give any guidance to parents when we can expect to see some of the early data that might come out of the Sideros trial? I know that it's recruiting right now, but is there a timeline that we can start to advise parents about what we're seeing in steroid-stable patients?
The current timeline, it looks like, the second half of 2020, but, we're marching towards getting adequate patients randomized. It's an 18-month study, and we're hoping by the end of 2020, we'll be able to have all the patients enrolled and start looking at the results. So it won't be prior to then.
Thank you for that, John.
Yep.
I think I've got to most of the questions that parents have, essentially.
I saw one question that said, where are the EAP sites going to be? And I think the best way to find that out is looking at clinicaltrials.gov.
You've got a faster link than I have. It just popped up as you read that out, Karen. Thank you. And one other one that just came up, it's one that from an individual whose son was tested and accepted into the clinical trial for idebenone. And as his function has deteriorated and decreased, is there an opportunity for him to have access to this drug outside of the study? Again, as part of the expanded access?
I think not.
That's
I think sorry, I was going to say if you qualify for the Sideros trial, then I don't think that you can qualify for the expanded access program.
Yes, that's correct. This is Jody Wolf from Santhera, and I just want to remind and note that the Sideros trial is 18 months long, and then afterwards, all of the patients, regardless of whether they're on idebenone or placebo, will have the opportunity to roll over into an open label extension where all patients will that participated in the trial will get drug.
And just to add one additional final point on that question, if the patient is no longer eligible for Sideros, let's say they're in the trial, they're no longer eligible to remain in the study for whatever the reason, they would be eligible for this EAP program. But if they are eligible, to Dr. Wagner's point, that is where they have to sort of remain in the study. It's when they're no longer eligible for that trial to remain in the study that they could be eligible for something like this.
Thank you for that. And I see one up from Bruce. Bruce, we touched on the second part of that question about the combination of idebenone and Q10 earlier on, and John dealt, with the differences between those, and certainly the effects would not be expected to be beneficial by layering one on top of the other. The first part of it is fairly complex, and what I'll do is take that outside of this call, and I'll talk to the reps, and we'll get some information and send that to you with some of the mechanism of actions of this compound.
I have a question for Santhera. So several patients get idebenone through compounding pharmacies. Do you have concern that the idebenone that's being received from compounding pharmacies is the same as the idebenone in the Sideros or expanded access program?
Sorry, John, do you want to take that?
Go ahead, Jody.
Okay. So currently available sources of idebenone are sold as supplements or vitamins or similar things like this. And that's not in compliance with FDA regulation. FDA classifies idebenone as a medicinal product which requires approval under an NDA, which is a new drug application with the FDA. And specifically, the FDA has determined a long time ago that idebenone is not a vitamin or a supplement. It's a drug to be studied in clinical trials. So we're currently not selling the product in the U.S. It's currently not approved in the U.S. So it's hard for us to say exactly, what compounding pharmacies or online sources or supplements are made up of.
Got it.
Thank you for that, Judy. One of the things that I would add in as well is there's a list of compounds that parents will source, as nutraceuticals. And one always needs to be very, very careful from the source of these, particularly of buying it from ones that we know very little about over the internet. The idebenone that the company makes is actually controlled by the agencies, and the manufacturing process and the purities and indeed the impurities are very well characterized. So it's something that's quite different from what one would expect to see by buying this online.
Great. Are there any other questions?
We've got one again from Bruce that we touched upon right at the very beginning of this, and it really refers to some of the detailed data that's in the 52-week Delio study. And as you and I talked about it, John, I'd let you sort of go back onto that answer again, but it's whether you've actually got that information that Bruce was asking about with elbow flexor strength and some gain in extensor strength in the placebo population. Do you want to deal with that, or should we take that one offline?
We can quickly address that. So the patients in the Delos trial were largely non-ambulatory. 92% of them were non-ambulatory, and they had a Brooks score of 5 to 6. So they were essentially, the majority of them, unable to even raise their hand to mouth. When we looked at the handheld myometry results, we really didn't see any significant changes in either group. We didn't run statistics on it. It was an endpoint in the trial, but we didn't really see any significant changes, if you will, in either group. And we didn't, perform any sort of subgroup analyses of the different components of that. So the take-home, though, is that these boys were largely non-ambulatory, Brooks score of 5 to 6, so their upper limb function was very minimal to begin with.
Okay. And Bruce, to you, I'm happy to chat about this offline, and see where that data actually comes from. It's not something that I'm familiar with in that there data. So one final call from questions. If there's anything else that's out there, I'll take a moment for that, and I'll be handing it back to Deborah in a few seconds. One last one there from Linda is the CoQ10 question. And it's really, can one take a combination of CoQ10 in addition to idebenone? And I John, I think you answered that quite well. If you want to touch upon that one more time.
There's structural differences between CoQ10 and idebenone, and really the benefit of taking the two may not necessarily be there. We are allowing for it even in our ongoing study in the Citros trial, if patients perceive that there is benefit. But pharmacologically, at least the data that we've seen, we don't anticipate to be sort of any synergistic or additive benefit of taking the two together. The body's still producing adequate CoQ10. That's not the issue. The issue is something different, and that's where idebenone really helps with increasing ATP production in the mitochondria in general.
Okay, thank you. And final one I'll take before handing it back is from Bruce about some preclinical work. Is there preclinical animal comparative data with idebenone and CoQ10 in, for example, the MDX mouse model?
Yeah, there is some information that we could maybe work with you, Mike, to get it off to Bruce.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And Bruce, I'll take that offline and follow. You can follow up with me independently, and I'll coordinate that and get you that information. Okay. Firstly, thank you to the presenters. Thank you for the questions, and thank you to the Santhera team for taking their time to answer those. I think this is a really important, expanded access program for patients. Really been very thoughtful about the need for what patients are. Paying and at no cost and giving people access into this drug and being able to follow that there on top of what's going on with the Citrus trial. So, thank you again for all that you're doing in this here disease, the Santhera team. It is very much appreciated, and I speak for myself as well as the rest of the community that's out there. And with that, I'll hand it back to Deborah.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And a really big thank you to Dr. Wagner and John and Jody for this presentation. And again, thank you for keeping the Duchenne patients front and center of your work. This is a wonderful thing to be doing for the Duchenne community. We appreciate it. And just a reminder that this webinar will be recorded, and we'll be posting it up on social media just as soon as it's available, probably later this afternoon. And if you have any other further questions, you can always email me, Deborah@cureduchenne.org, and I'll pass them on to the team and get answers to you right away. So with that, I will conclude this webinar, and thank you very much for your participation and wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude today's conference. We thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect.